was born in Crystal City, Texas, or Cristal, as I learned in my first language, Espanol, to call it. I was born October 25th, 1944. And it was a Chicano town, on the Chicano side of town. We call ourselves Chicanos. Now, my father kept correcting me, saying, no, eres Mexicano, because he was de Mexico. In fact, he was born aquí in Matamoros in 1883, August the 2nd. And he was part of the class of revolucionarios back when he was 15 or 16. The mother and father, I don't know what happened to my grandfather. There's pieces that are missing in my family history. Took him to Torreon, Coahuila, and put him in medical school. And when he was in the medical school, Pancho Villa came through and took them all to be in his army. Pancho Villa is credited, at least in the Mexican literature, but not globally, as the first military leader to have an ambulatory medical corps. But he is the architect of that. And then when Villa took over Torreon in the mid-20s, for some reason, my father by that time had gotten older, of course, and moved up. Was a trained doctor, even though he didn't have the degree, obtained the degree and ingratiated himself with the people there in Torreon, and they elected him mayor of Torreon toward the late 20s. And then Plutarco Calles was trying to form what today is the PRI. And my father and he did not get along. You know, Mexico at that time was governed during the revolution by all these caciques, these individuals who had strong control over an area. And Calles was trying to put them all together into one national political party, and he did, but my father was not one of his supporters. So he got exiled, and he was sent here and there, New Orleans, even South Texas, in El Valle aquí. I've got leaflets where he gave speeches here in the Valley back then, in McAllen and Brownsville, and then finally he moved all the way up to Cristal area and became a real good friend with my grandfather on my mother's side, which is Ignacio Fuentes. And his oldest daughter, Concepcion, is my mother. But Concepcion was 16, and he was already like 50. But por el compadrazgo en the tomadera con el viejo Nacho y Don Ángel, the two older men, he asked for my mother in hand in marriage, and of course the age disparity was tremendous, and my mother didn't want anything to do with this. So the two viejos agreed that would be a good idea, and my grandfather Nacho made my father promise that if something happened to him, he would take care of the entire family. Now, the entire family was 17. So that was a big load, but my father by that time had been certified in Mexico as well as the United States. He passed his boards and things, so he was licensed as a doctor in Texas and in Tamaulipas and Coahuila. So se le hizo fácil decir, pues que sí, that he could take care of the family. It was almost prophetic because my grandfather, Ignacio, got killed in Detroit in those race riots and problems at the Ford Motor Company plant. So he died. My grandmother was pregnant with the 17th child, Lucia. And so my father had to take on that burden, and of course they did marry. But my mother refused to have anything to do with him, much less cohabitation, for 10 years. It wasn't until she was 26 and realized there was no way out of this marriage and that he was taking care of the entire family that she consented to having me as a child. My father was a real Mexicano, always talking about la política en Mexico, reading newspapers in Espanol, making me read them, insisted that I learn Spanish formally at a escuelita del barrio, like all back then when the schools were segregated and they didn't allow us. I was sent to a kinder in Espanol, Suse Salazar, la escuelita de Suse was what it was called. And I learned bilingually. Ahí aprendí mi español and the introduction to English. The teacher was very good at teaching us math, all the cognitive skills, pero en español, to get into developing our cognitive skills and adding the English despacito. And I remember we had to say the alphabet, we had to say the vowels and the consonants in English and Spanish. We had to say the multiplication tables in English and Spanish, and we'd stand there with our little hands. And if we made a mistake, she'd hit us with the rulers in our hands. And if you got it right, then you get a little popsicle, which was an ice cube with un palito, you know, and you'd get that. And if you flunked, you could buy then the little popsicle. But that was the treat. And we had apple crates upside down to be our desks. It was a fascinating time. And then I was taken to the public schools and segregated. But my mother then, while my father's doing all this emphasis on Spanish, my mother was doing all the emphasis in English. And since my father was learned, in the evenings when we'd sit outside, there was no air conditioning, y mi madre estaba regando. Él platicaba de astronomía, de la mitología griega, de los romanos, de la historia de la religión cristianos católicos, la historia de España, de México, la revolución. Things I didn't understand, but I was hearing all these things. Y luego mi madre me venía y me decía en inglés, you know, what she knew, because she did begin to learn to, I think she only went to like the 7th grade, but then she got the equivalent of a GED through correspondence. And she knew the importance of English and for me to have a career choice. Now, they wanted me to be a doctor, and I saw what my father went through. You know, partos a las 2 de la mañana, y enfermos en domingo en la mañana, y accidentes el viernes en la noche. He never had a life of his own. I didn't want to do that. So I learned to say that I was going to be a lawyer, but I never knew what a lawyer was. I never met one. And I started saying that just to get him off. So I ended up going to law school, not necessarily because I wanted that, but that's what I had said, so I led myself to believe that that's what I wanted. So getting back to when my father died, even though he was a doctor, his clientele was all Mexican, y Chicano, Mexican field hands, and we had the Bracero program there in Cristal. So that's who he treated, and then the Chicanos from the community. So they paid him in chickens and bushels of spinach, and or cutting the yard or washing his car. So we were not wealthy. We certainly were better off than the average migrant worker in Cristal. But when he died, that world turned upside down, because then we were poor like everybody else. And I did have half-brothers. I told you my father moved around because of the revolution. He has other family. I have other half-brothers and sisters that I haven't all met. And now they're probably dead because of the age difference. But one half-brother kept all the property and defrauded my mother, forged the signatures, and so we were left destitute and in poverty. So we had to become migrants. And I remember having to struggle with that to the point that even as a junior in college, I did not know anything else but working and going to school. I didn't know about scholarships, I didn't know about loans, I didn't know about work study. I was finally introduced to some of that later on in college. And the only scholarship that I competed for was to go to the junior college. And it was offered by the Mexican Chamber of Commerce. Now here in high school, I was an exceptional student in the sense that I was upset at what things had happened to me and to others like me. For example, I became the class president my junior year because the population of my high school changed from majority Anglo to majority Mexican my junior year. And I was able to organize, and that's when I finally also went out for the football team because I made it a point to start school on time. Before I was migrant, so I'd leave early and come back late, so I never could be involved in school activities and so. But the football team was segregated, so that we always made the B team. And I was almost as large as I am now, certainly not the weight, but about the same height. And I was a pretty physical kind of young kid, so we would be used as the dummies to tackle. And well, I figured that out real quick, and I said, I'm not going to take all these golpes. No way. And just by accident, I happened to walk by the auditorium one day, and all these pretty girls, Anglo, were practicing. They were saying poetry and acting out things. And I saw a couple of white guys, but basically no Chicanos. And I'm looking through the window, again, no air conditioning. And the speech coach, a fellow by the name of Aston Pegues, yelled at me for me to get away and go away or come in. Well, I mean, I was interested in the pretty girls, so by the time my hormones were in full swing, and I was not accepting this social distance between Mexicanos and Chicanos. I really didn't know much about all that. I knew that we were different. We lived on a different side of town, and we were migrants, and we spoke mostly Spanish, and the whites didn't have much to do with us. made fun of us, beat us up when we spoke Spanish, and the teachers, and you had to hide your tacos when you ate them, things of that sort. So I kind of knew, but I didn't know that I could do anything about it. But I was attracted to these girls, and it didn't help that they were blonde and blue-eyed, because that was different. So I went inside, and he says, if you come in here, you're going to have to read poetry. Well, no Chicano is going to read poetry. But I said, in my mind, I processed, but if I want to be near them, I better learn poetry. So he handed me this thing, and I don't even remember what it was, but I looked at it, and he said, okay, come on up here and read. Well, I read, and he stopped me halfway through. He said, you're the first Mexican kid that doesn't speak with an accent, and you enunciate. I didn't know what that word meant. And he told me all these wonderful skills that I had. Well, I didn't know. I mean, I should have known, as we all do in older age, that all of us come with talent, different talents, but we all have it. You need someone to nurture that. Well, he started working with me and said, well, you're going to be in the one-act play, and you're going to be in a debate team, and you're going to try out for declamation, extemporaneous speaking, and all these were words that I had never heard before, much less interscholastic league. I thought that was something that had to do with space or something, Well, because I was interested in those gringuitas, I practiced, and he taught me how to speak. And I became the first Chicano state champion in Texas in public speaking. I mean, it was unheard of. That same year, a young man by the name of Richie Gallegos, also won the state championship in the mile run for our size of school. Another one, Ricardo Romo, who's now the president of UTSA, won the largest school mile run, also named Ricardo. So we were kind of the champions, and everybody was making a big to-do about this. This was 1961. I was a junior and class president. So that time, I also had to do the prom for the seniors. And we raised money, and we had an election for prom servers. And my principal, who was my hero at the time, a great big guy, ex-Marine, very disciplinarian, about 6'3", 240 pounds, just a mountain of a man. I wanted to be like him until that day when I took in the returns for the election of prom servers, and we were all Chicanos and Chicanas. And he threw them away. And he said, no, we're not going to have race mixing here. And he drew a line on a piece of paper, wrote a bunch of names, and handed me. I said, now these Mexicans will be using the slur, these will be the ones, and these will be the Anglos, and we're not going to have them paired up. And I said, well, that's not what the election was, and you're invalidating the election, and I'm not going to do that. He said, well, if you don't, you're going to get expelled. Well, I went back and got the class together and explained to them and that I was not going to do anything about it, but that's what he said. And I had this coraje build up inside. I mean, how could this man do this? And this is contrary to what we're reading in the books. In order to get an A in history and government, you got to learn about the majority rule and democracy. And so here was this contradiction between ideals and reality. And that's when it started sinking in. Then later in that year, we had the selection of school favorites. The most handsome and the most beautiful and the most representative and the most popular and stuff. And they changed the rules on us too. Like I remember the most handsome and most beautiful, they said that they were going to contact Kim Novak and Troy Donahue or some movie stars to judge our pictures and see who would be selected. And time went by and we hadn't heard. One day we were up to no good, so we broke into the school and went into the journalism teacher's desk and went to the desk and found this packet with the pictures and letters from Kim Novak and Troy Donahue, I think it was, saying that they didn't feel that they could judge our standard of beauty and that all the kids that were submitted were beautiful and they just didn't want to do this. Well, we couldn't tell anybody that we had been rejected, and here the program was scheduled like a week later. Well, I'll be damned if we didn't have the program and they had forged the signatures of these people, I guess putting the letter up in the glass window like we do to sketch and trace. They had these letters saying they picked these Anglos to be the most handsome and most beautiful. So I knew the system was corrupt, but I also knew that I couldn't do anything about it. And I made a personal vow then to channel my hate and my disgust to rage, to fix this so it wouldn't happen again. And that's when I believe my activism began, because I tried to find ways to do things to change that. Coincidentally, by my senior year in 1962, you have then a beginning of political activism in our community by an organization called PASO, Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations. Now, I have to mention that, In 58 and in 60, Henry B. Gonzalez came to town, running for governor, running for U.S. senator, something. And I remember the whole town was abuzz about, vamos a ver al líder de la raza. And that líder, to me, that was so alien. It was a word I'd never heard. My father never used that. He always used revolucionario or político, but not líder. And I thought it was just a Chicano word, just a made-up word, for leader. And so that told me we didn't have any, and this was the only one we had, so I went to go see. But I was a little kid. And he stood on a platform and he gave this speech and he had on a nice suit and he spoke in English and he spoke well like me, without an accent and in clear enunciation. I was learning all these words then. And so I said, pues este Henry B. se avienta, man. Este vato está desgraciado. Eh? These were the things la palomilla, the chavalada processed. Well, now all of a sudden we have this movement developing and I gravitate toward there and I'm the state champion in speaking in English. So beyond selling poll taxes and bringing out the chairs y las bancas at the placita and helping the women sell tamales and raffle tickets para el cakewalk and all that, somebody asked me to give a speech for the candidatos. And the first time we had all 5 Mexicanos running. So I said, yeah. I didn't think I gave any fantastic speech. I just spoke in English about the problems I saw in our community and why we needed to have these Mexicanos fix them. And I said things like, the gringos have had all this chance to fix them and they don't want to fix it. It's not that they don't know, they don't care about it. They don't want to fix it, so we got to have Mexicanos who do care, who will fix it. Well, this went over real big. They thought I was real brave. I thought I was just saying, como dicen los niños y los borrachos dicen la verdad, So I was just telling the truths that I saw. Well, the bravery part was not only saying it in English so that the gringos could hear. I mean, the raza was terrified. You were not saying anything that would offend the Anglo, el Americano, el Mister. Well, we also had the Texas Rangers patrolling our political rallies. Well, I learned that as long as there was a crowd and as long as you could defend your position and you could say things about them. And so I did. I would point and say, van los pinches rinches, Piensan que nos van a intimidar. We're not afraid. We're right here. Pues this was just tremendous for the crowd because I learned that crowds vicariously identify with the speaker, and when you vision things for them and articulate things for them, they take it as their own words. So pretty soon everybody will see los pinches rinches and showing defiance. So that's how I learned the public speaking in a mature way, because I had learned it from Doña Suse, reciting el abecedario y los consonantes y las tablas, and then in school, and then the speech business in high school, and now this is real stuff. And I got into tangles with the Rangers. I mean, they tried to intimidate me, and then I was even, they attempted to assassinate me by kidnapping me, and I learned that this politics can be good, it can also be bad. But I got more enraged. I said, I'm not gonna be stopped, and I'm not afraid of these people. All they could do was kill me, right? And history is full of people getting killed. And I read history in a different way. I realized that it's all violent. Nothing ever changes peacefully. It's violent. And poverty is violence. And arresting people when there's no cause is violent. And harassing us and intimidating us with violence. So I saw that this was a very violent kind of game, just like football. And just like the luchas that we played in el barrio. And so to me, it was all part of the same thing. I didn't get a negative attitude that I was afraid. It was just another challenge, with bigger people. But it also is a time where we have the poll tax, and you had to be 21 years of age. So I couldn't participate meaningfully except through speeches, registering, selling the poll tax illegally, and trying to raise money and helping the crowd along. Well, the cinco candidatos won, and I got a patronage job. I got to be the head of Parks and Recreation, all at the age of about 17 and a half, and all this meant was that I had to run the swimming pool, because that's the only thing we had. So we integrated the pool, and I had the job of staying there the first time in my life during the summer. I'd been a migrant before. And my job was to tell these adult gringos to not drink and to get away. Now we had Chicano cops for the first time. Well, they were afraid to arrest Anglos. They didn't know what was going to happen. So it was very scary, very dangerous times, but I managed. To make it short, all that ended. And I was so disappointed to see this infighting, which I thought at that time was envidia, but later I began to realize, no, we have help in screwing up. And there's such a thing as divide and conquer, and such a thing as the power, to harass you and intimidate you legally like they did with Mario Hernandez with those bad checks. So I took off. I went to Los Angeles, California, and I hooked up over there with the Paso equivalent. They call themselves MAPA, Mexican American Political Association. And Ed Quevedo Sr. Became my mentor, and other individuals who were involved with that movement there. So I learned under them a little bit, pero no me sosiegaba. You know, I knew that I'd done the wrong thing. I was making good money. It was an accident. I was working, first I lived out of the train station for about 3-4 days. And I was befriended by a prostitute that used to work there because I used to bathe in the bathroom there with the lavatory and change clothes. I only had a little morralito, and she finally took me in and then helped me set up. And then I started working with the newspaper as a copy boy, the one on bicycles not selling, but taking advertising copy here, the photographs and the layouts. Dangerous work because you got all this traffic in downtown LA. I'd never been in a big city other than San Antonio. It was gnawing on me to go back to school and go back to Texas, and I did. So I came back and finished up at the community college because I couldn't go to the University of Texas at Austin. I lost out the scholarship from the Mexican Chamber of Commerce to the quarterback. They thought he had a better chance. So I didn't have any money. And when I filled out the application, nobody counseled me, nobody helped me. It asked where my mother was, so I put down the address up north. So they classified me as a non-resident and wanted 3 times the amount of tuition. And I sent letters and I got people to notarize documents saying, no, he's from here, you know. It didn't work. So when I applied to the junior college, I lied. I said my mother was right there, you know. So I got in as a resident. That's why I had to go to the junior college. And then I transferred out and came to A&I in Kingsville. So at A&I started organizing a Paso chapter, and the university, like all universities, insisted on faculty sponsors. Well, I couldn't find any. And then they wanted to have the charter from the national organization you belong to. Well, Paso was almost defunct. I mean, I couldn't get them to send me anything. Then it was political. And they said, well, they didn't allow political organizations on campus, even though they had young Democrats and young Republicans. So I learned to fight at the campus. And that's about the time that Vietnam is already beginning to develop, and you got the beginning of a black movement that we hear about. And we're already hearing about Chavez and Tijerina and the farm workers in the Valley, and La Casita farms are already kind of beginning to do things. So it's in the wind, you know, and I was able to put together a coalition of whites and blacks and students from all over, and cheated in a way. Our ID cards did not have photographs back then. So through parties, beer parties and dances and socializing, I collected all the IDs of the 1,028 some odd Mexicanos that were on the campus and voted them all with a handful. We go to this polling place and vote 30, 40. We go to the other polling place and vote another. The same ones will go vote another 30, 40. We won, and we had issues changing the Constitution to plurality instead of majority, off-campus representatives. So we won, not only the election, but won the change, the structural change. So we took over. But I graduated and had to leave, so the next generation then, you know, was able to get on. But that's where I learned my mass mobilization skills of getting big demonstrations and organizing things, going after the president and faculty people. And I learned a lot. I learned there that the Chicanos got flunked for taking orientation. They would actually flunk us because then we had to take it again and pay more money again. I had heard of that at the community college, but I hadn't experienced it until I got to A&I. And then they imposed the English essay, that if you didn't write an essay that they approved of, you couldn't graduate. So I began to see this as discrimination against us as a class at the institutional level of the university. And since I had told myself I was going to be a lawyer, pues I went to law school. Now the draft board in Uvalde, Ruth Webb, ever since high school, when she knew that I was already, quote, a troublemaker, every time school ended, she would classify me 1A. And every time I went to school, she would change my status to 2S again, student deferment, when we had the conscription at that time. Well, she did the same thing again when I graduated from college, but I went to law school, so it was a deferment again. And Houston was terrible. There were only 3 Mexicanos in the freshman class of law school. Raul Gonzalez was one of the ones up above. Lupe Salinas, who does now some work here, he's a lawyer and former judge in Houston, does some work here in Hidalgo County as a visiting judge. Those were some of the people that were up in the upper classes, but only 3 Mexicanos, no women of any color, no blacks. It was all these white boys from East Texas and 3 Mexicanos. And again, from day one, I had a problem because when I would speak, they would be against me. Not only my students, but the professors. And it was very difficult for me. I didn't flunk, but I couldn't stand it. They weren't ready for me, and I was not ready for them. I thought that going to law school, that I could change the world. And little did I realize that law school is how you least change the world, because to keep the system the way it is. That's why they operate on precedents and stare decisis and all the layers of judges and all the appeals and the cost of litigation. But I didn't know that. So I got frustrated. After 9 months, I left. Very frustrated because I thought at that time that the study of law was not an intellectual challenge. You asked why, and they tell you because. 600 years of Anglo-Saxon law, common law. Well, to me that meant they just legitimized how they stole land and how they killed people and all these crimes that they committed to take our lands. Now they made it into law, like adverse possession, that if I take your land and hold it for 20 years, it's mine. Or if I brand my cow and it's on inside my fence line, it's mine. These things, I began to see how the whole system was structured. And when I got to graduate school, because I had no other option, I had some faculty friends from A&I who told me that I should go to graduate school. I didn't think I could make it. I didn't think I had the smarts. But when I get to graduate school at St. Mary's, where my old professor, Charlie Cottrell, was now in government, the whole world opened up. Then when I would ask why, he'd say, well, I don't know, but here's 3 articles and here's 2 books. Well, all of a sudden now, instead of just because 600 years of Anglo-Saxon law, and I had all these windows of opportunity and intellectual stimulus. So I really flourished. Well, believe me that I didn't know what I was doing. It was almost kind of like trial and error. And it was just that commitment to make change. It was that channeling of rage to constructive means instead of hateful bigotry that got me started. When I got to St. Mary's, I'd already had the Paso experience at A&I and the mass mobilization of demonstrations and things. I'd already had the Cristal electoral experience and that frustration. So I already knew how to run elections. I knew how to move groups. I knew how to speak. What I didn't know was how to organize a group into an effective unit. I knew I didn't want to do a LULAC type of thing. I didn't want to do an American GI Forum thing. Besides, they wouldn't let us. We had to be 21, you had to be a veteran, and so on. And Paso was already defunct. So just by accident, meeting some other guys there, and it was all guys, Willie Velázquez, Ignacio Pérez, and Juan Patlan, Mario Compián. Compián, Velázquez, and I were at St. Mary's. Pérez was doing volunteer work with the farm workers and working out of the Bishop's Committee. Patlan was a former college peer from junior college. He was from Carrizo Springs. He was selling insurance or had just dropped out of UT Austin or something. So they were kind of in the community. But the 5 of us started drinking beer together. Get together and have a beer. And we were all complaining about the same thing. So we came upon this idea of forming an organization of organizers, a young people's group. And that was the beginning, the genesis of Mayo, the Mexican American Youth Organization. And then we looked at what the problems were, and of course, then, like today, you ask somebody, what's the most pressing issue facing Mexican Americans? Invariably, they'll tell you, well, it's education and the dropout rate. Well, we didn't believe that there was such a thing as a dropout. We thought we were pushed out, and we knew because we were spanked for speaking Spanish, we were humiliated, we were made to identify with Davy Crockett and say that Santana was a dictator and the Mexicans were terrible, or we were all dumb, poor, and migrant, all these negative things, because the school system denudes you and strips you of your culture and your heritage and reprograms you to be Anglo-like. I mean, in order to succeed in the American public education system, you got to be an Anglo. That's what their job is, and it doesn't fit, it doesn't wear well. So we took on education. We said, well, what could we do? Well, if we couldn't get an education, then no one else could either. So that's how we started saying, well, we're going to do school strikes, school walkouts. If they're not going to let us speak Spanish, and if they're not going to let us have Mexican food in the cafeteria, and we can't play Mexican music, and we can't have Chicano history, and have Chicano teachers, then nobody will have any school. It was that simple. So we started doing school strikes all over the state, and across the country, other people were doing basically the same thing. Now, I had never heard of anybody else except there in Texas, but it was happening elsewhere. And so we started then hearing about these people, an occasional news clip or a newspaper article, or somebody would say, "Pues, I heard about this group in California or in Oregon or in Colorado, and there's this guy in New Mexico that wants to take the land back." And so we started traveling. We would get in the car and travel to Albuquerque or to Atlanta. We'd hear about Martin Luther King Jr. We'd go there to find out what it was all about. Earlier, when I was a migrant, I went to listen to Malcolm X in Chicago. So we did this hands-on type of thing. So nobody would tell us what was happening because you couldn't read about it. So we'd bring back literature, or we'd bring back tape recordings of what we heard. And we have a study circle about these things. So we then began refining what our agenda was, and we screwed up many walkouts. I mean, I myself participated in 39 school walkouts and failed in 38 of them. 39 was Cristal in 1969, where I succeeded. And it was a learning process. That's also why I wrote the Gringo Manual on how to handle Mexicans. There were no books about us then. Nothing. There was nobody you could ask. There was nobody to tell you, other than the old LULAC types and the JR Forum types, and what they told you was like a parent, "No, pues no tienen 21, you're not ready yet." Well, that's no lesson. That's not an instruction. So there was very few people we could contact. So we just decided to do it ourselves. And that's how we began organizing. The youth were with us right away. I mean, they had the same problems we had a generation back. So we were connected. Our grandparents, those of the age of my father, the old revolucionarios, they were connected to us because they understood about the gringo and the problems. It was that parent in the middle, like right now, this Hispanic generation, that's that buffer. You can't get through them. We need an agenda today to go organize the middle class, because that's the biggest problem we've got. But the poor people, the women, the youth, were all alienated. So we hit some responsive chords. And that's when you see the youth movement, the farm worker movement, the women's movement, the militant Chicano movement all come together and flourish, and we were just a small part. But we were the biggest part in Texas, because these movements were also being replicated in other states. So we did leafleting against the war in Vietnam. We took on the Catholic Church, saying, "How come you don't stand with us? You ask us for money every Sunday, but you don't stand with us the rest of the week. If you talk about injustice, why don't you come here and face it like we do? Don't tell us that that if we suffer and we do penance, we're going to go to heaven, and that the gringo is going to go to hell. He's in heaven right now. We want heaven here. This is hell for us right now." So we were making these kinds of connections, and that was very radical. Demanding that we speak in Spanish and have bilingual was considered radical. They called us communists. So we in losing these walkouts, we began to learn that we had to have the parents. We had to have the business people on the Mexican side of town with us. We had to neutralize the press. So we had to come up with our own newspapers. We had to have press releases, so we'd give it to the Anglos who didn't know what we were saying in Spanish. So they would write the story of what we wanted them to say, not what we said. Because we found out that they were overworked and sometimes lazy, and so if you give it to them in English, they would print it just like you gave it to them. So we learned how to manipulate the media, and we also learned how to take on the Rangers. We brought cameras like this ourselves, and tape recorders and little photography cameras, and when we had those with us, the Rangers wouldn't hurt us because they were afraid of the publicity. So what the Mexicanos saw was this young group of Mexicano kids attacking the Rangers, confronting them face to face, telling them things. Of course, our insurance was the cameras and the media. And from what they saw, the Rangers backed down because they didn't hurt us. So that gave a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of invigorating to the community that we were not afraid like they were. Well, when we plugged in all these dimensions, we then realized we had to take over the school board. So that's the beginning ideas of we got to have a political party here. Mind you, by this time we all have college degrees. Some of us have master's degrees by then. Some of us, like in my case, I wrote a thesis studying South Texas, and I knew it was ready for revolt. So not only did I learn it, I went out and proved it, which is the true measure of a social scientist. You just came up with some idea in a vacuum, you go test it. And I did, and it was true. It succeeded. So we formed a political party in January 1970. I called it La Raza Unida Party. Now, we had to organize the women, had to organize the men, and here, by the time I was married, I married Luz Bazan from Falfurrias in 67, just before I got my master's in 68, and had been, again, Ruth Webb, the draft board, she got me. Even though I was married, had a child on the way, In my PhD program, I was the first Mexican American in the entire UT system to be in a PhD program in that time, 1968. And I had to quit because they drafted me. So I had to suspend my Mayo activity, and that's how Mario Compián became the chair of Mayo, because I took off to the Army. I came back more politicized than ever, really angry at what had happened to me and how they denied my deferment. There were 2 Mexicanos on the Selective Service Board, and they voted with the Anglos against the law. I mean, if you're married, you could have got a deferment. If you're married and have a dependent, more so. And if you're married with a dependent and in a career like a PhD, and you're already 23, 24, you should have got the deferment. They violated all of that. So I was very angry, very upset. But nevertheless, I came back and started organizing, and my wife and I realized that our communities are segregated. You know, even to this day here in the Valley, if you go to a function at somebody's house, the women will stay by the kitchen or with the kids in the house, and the men will go outside either to smoke and drink and cook out, or all three, drinking, smoking, and cooking. And it's only at the mealtime that you kind of get some integration. Usually the men will eat first. The women will serve them, they'll eat, and then the men go back outside again, and the women are still segregated. So we started an organization called Ciudadanos Unidos. And she worked with the women, and I worked with the men. And then we agreed that on a certain day, the women would come, just like we had done with Paso when I was in A&I. We showed up in mass, all these young people, to the Paso convention and said, we're here, we're going to vote on this resolution we're introducing to lower the age of membership to 18. And now, mind you, we're not members, we're ineligible, and we present a resolution that's not supposed to be accepted, and we vote on it, and it's accepted, so they let us in. Well, the women did the same thing. They came to the male Ciudadanos Unidos and said, we're here, we want to be members, we want to be able to be officers, we're going to vote, we're going to stay here, and we're going to vote on that. So, of course, you know, we integrated Ciudadanos Unidos, and from then on, it became a family affair. And that's how we organized Cristal, by families. You know, we found out who were the activists. There had been a walkout in Cristal already in the spring of '69 over the baseball tournament. You know, you can't come into a community and say, well, we've got a problem with crime or with drugs or with dropouts, and tell them we've got to organize around that. It doesn't happen like that. The people will tell you what's important to them. And that spring, what was important was that at the Popeye tournament, because Cristal is the spinach capital of the world, we have a statue of Popeye, and our baseball tournament is called the Popeye Tournament. Well, they selected some Anglo girl to be the sweetheart of the tournament. And the Chicanas got all upset, saying, this is discrimination. How come, you know, the majority of the baseball players are Mexican, the teams coming are Mexican, this is Cristal, it's a Mexican town, how come we don't get to have one? So the principal, that same John Lair, the same one that gutted me earlier, said, okay, we'll have two, one Mexican, well, his words, one Mexican and one Anglo girl. Well, the students had to accept that, separate but equal, because it was in late April, early May. And if we walked out then, we already knew, if you walked out then, you would flunk and lose, because they didn't have to do anything, which is what happened in Uvalde, 40 miles up. The students there didn't listen to us and boycotted the schools in the spring. All the Chicanitos were drafted, and about half of them got killed in Vietnam. So, but it's lessons you learn. So those kids then listened and said, okay, we won't do the walkout, but you got to promise us you're going to come back and help us do the walkout in the fall. And that's how I ended up going to Cristal, because it was a promise. As well as that the Mayo board had agreed that Cristal would be one of the sites we'd look at for the next walkout. So by that time, we had already learned that Anglos would always call our guys, the Mayo people, outside agitators. Well, you can't call a local boy an outside agitator if he's from there. So we started changing our tactics, so we would send locals back to their community. I was from Cristal, so I went back. And we started organizing in the summer. As the migrant families are coming back, we had time. The Resendez family is coming, the Martinez mañana, the Gomez's next week, and we started talking to them about what was going to happen and how we had Ciudadanos Unidos. So they were ready. And sure enough, the school board was as predictable as they were in the spring. Football season starts. Homecoming queen issue comes up, the cheerleader comes up, they want to have one Mexican girl, the sweetheart's going to be Anglo, the homecoming queen's going to be Anglo, and we said no. So we told the students, go ahead and go tell them that's not going to happen, that you want the popular election and you want the Mexicano to win. And of course, school board said no. So that led to the walkout, through a lot of other things. But we had no choice finally but to walk out of school, and we had the parents supporting us, we had the business community supporting us, that Mexican Chamber of Commerce that denied me that scholarship, and we had the experience from the spring, that we now had all year to beat them, and we did. By that time, we already had created the Mexican Legal Defense Fund in '68, so we got free lawyers, and we had some of the old guys who were still involved in Paso, even though that was dead. They were very much alive. Albert Peña Jr., Joe Bernal, who had gotten he cut his teeth out here in the Valley with the Rangers. He was now a state senator. He came to Cristal, and we had some of the militant priests, the Chicano priests, Father Caso, for example, Barragan. You had other individuals Cheryl Smith, not all of them were Chicanos, some were Anglos, like Cheryl Smith. They came and got involved with us. So we were very legitimate, and the community supported us. So we whipped the school board. We did it with a lot of good tactics. For example, you have, say 600 kids out of school. What do you do with them? You can only keep them in parks and teach classes, temporarily, but what do you do with the rest of the time? So we started sending them to other communities to do voter registration. So the gringos in Cotula or in Carrizo or in Pearsall or in Valle were calling the gringos in Cristal saying, what are your kids doing here? They're registering people here, they're causing trouble, they're putting ideas into these kids. You solve that problem over there. So not only did they have pressure from us, now you had the Anglo elite from the area calling them also saying, settle it, contain it, which is the same policy that we were following in Vietnam, contain communism right there. So these were things that we just kind of stumbled on by watching what's going on in the world and adapting them to our local needs. That worked very well. We also sent the kids to Washington, D.C., and they interviewed with some of the liberal congressmen and senators like Kennedy, and even Tower got into the picture. Because remember, Tower won because of the Mexicano vote. We didn't have a Republican Party to speak of. And the Democrat nominee was so bad that we had to vote against the Democrat by voting for Tower. So he received them. So here we have the national people putting pressure on the Texas people. We had TEA coming to investigate and realizing what they were doing to us there in the school. So all this mounts, and the board capitulates, says we want to cease fire, we want to settle an agreement. We said, no. If we just take the piece of paper, we're going to get screwed because it'll be the same school board, same superintendent, same teachers when we go back into the class. So immediately, right after the Christmas holidays, when they capitulated, we started working for the April elections for the school board. But the Raza Unida Party then grew national. We got very important that way. And of course, that brought the surveillance by the FBI and the disruption and destruction. And a lot of people were killed and arrested and charged. And it didn't help any that Ramsey Muñiz, our great candidate for governor in '72, and also in '74, then gets hooked up with drugs, with marijuana basically, jumps bail, gets convicted, and then he's gotten convicted subsequently. So it's kind of like verifying, well, see, there was smoke there. I mean, we really were telling you that these were all druggies and dope pushers. That wasn't true. But after the fact now, some of that is validated because of what happened with Ramsey and a couple of other people. But by and large, it wasn't our activity in crime that they hated. It was our politics that they hated and used a criminal allegation to destroy us, our reputations and our credibility. So we then took over the cities. We then took over counties. We started getting some local resources because I didn't have to pay for my phone bill anymore. I could make phone calls for county business or school business, communicate with other schools that were similar, and I didn't have to pay for it because it was legitimate educational activity. We didn't have to find gas money to go to a protest or a convention. We now had a field trip, and we'd use the yellow buses to move students or to send administrators paid. We were able to hire Chicano administrators. We created superintendents like crazy. We had a training program for superintendents and created a need for people to be trained in Chicano studies and bilingual ed. We created employment opportunities for those kinds of people. And it changed the nature of politics. I mean, now it was legit for people to want power. Before se asustaban. No, ¿cómo? Yo no estoy qualified, no puedo. Now, everybody, especially here in the Valley, everybody here runs for office now. It's a given thing to do. Well, that's because of Raza Unida, that's because of those things back then. And of course, the Chicano studies programs across the nation and just the militancy that we deserve recognition and acceptance as who we are. The Mexicanos for a long, long time didn't accept us because we talked funny, and they said we were gringos. And the gringos didn't like us because we were Mexicans. So we only did the logical thing is, we learned to love ourselves, Now, when I took my entrance exam for law school, I scored well, and they said I was going to make a fantastic lawyer. When I took the GRE, I scored poorly, and they said I never could become an academic. And as it turns out, I got a PhD before I got a law degree. And I enjoy more the academic side than I enjoy the law side. But it never left me. I'll jump ahead of time and tell you that finally in 86, from 66, 20 years later, in 86, I went back and got a law degree from the same place, the University of Houston, no más porque soy terco, no one's going to knock me down and me not get up. I've been knocked down many, many times, but I think the best lesson is that I learned how to get up from being knocked down. Now we have an opportunity to change the world and make it the way you want it. Why do I say that? Because it's true, our truth. Look at the numbers. Look at all of you sitting here getting capacity, getting skills, getting degrees. ¿De qué va a servir if you don't go out there and change that world? Now we have critical mass. In Brownsville, you had this a century ago. So, it's a different environment here, and maybe you're so used to it, como pescados en el agua. Do you think they know they're in water? You think a fish knows it's in water? It's so pervasive and such an atmosphere for them, they don't even think about it. Y aquí la gente in the border is like that too. No, hombre, aquí controlamos, que pura raza. Pues sí, papi, pero vete para Abilene. Or sometimes they come to you. Have you seen today's newspaper? They just divided the Valle in terms of the congressional districts. So even if you don't want to mess with the gringos, they're messing with you. And they're taking away your future, your political power. And now that just because of the numbers, we're replacing blacks in America as the minority, and in some places like Texas, we will be the majority, replacing whites and blacks. Well, that gives us responsibilities. We owe society something. We're going to have the opportunity to be the leaders and the governors and the power. Well, we owe society for that opportunity. We got to give back. It's not enough just to take what everybody else has made possible for you. You got to make sure that others get the same opportunity or better than you did. So we have a need for greater social capital, but we also have more responsibilities for social debt. We got to pay back with interest. So these are opportunities and times to organize, and I'm very optimistic that it can. First of all, I'm still here. I'm 55, only 55. My kids are grown. I have grandkids. We now have 3 generations here present that can mobilize, can organize, and many of us have resources now. I didn't have resources back then. I'm comfortable today. I can afford to give a donation. I can go give us free speech. I can be a follower. I can leaflet, and I know what I'm doing. I can teach others. I can write the books. I have. None of that was there before. We were solitos, abandonados. Not even Mexico wanted to recognize us. Now we have international attention. We've got resources. We've got brain power. We got lots of people. We got critical mass. We got great opportunity. And we have to lead not for Anglos and not for blacks, for ourselves. We have to lead ourselves. We can't keep letting others lead us, especially now that we're going to be a majority. You got to reprogram yourself in order to feel good. And you got to infect others around you. To do the quinceañeras and the tamaladas y las charreadas and the fiestas y la plática y la política, we need to build community. Visioning the future, articulating people's emotions and feelings is a good way to organize, because my dreams are no different than anybody else's dreams. That person that can articulate, the person that can capture that vision and make it a dream will recruit followers. You just got to deliver, and you deliver by being honest, dedicated, and never letting the flag drop. No dejes caer la bandera.